Marcus Sterling stood at the altar in his custom Italian suit, completely unaware that the wife he'd divorced 3 months ago, the woman he'd abandoned, along with their sick child, had just closed a $100 billion contract that would reshape the global tech industry forever. But as his mistress, Vanessa, glided down the aisle in her crystal-encrusted gown, the church doors exploded open, and what walked through would shock him in ways that would haunt him for the rest of his miserable life. His ex-wife, Elena, hadn't just won the impossible contract everyone said was fantasy. She'd become the most powerful woman in Silicon Valley overnight, and she'd brought their son, the sick child Marcus claimed was too much of a burden, who was now miraculously healthy and standing tall beside her. But how did Elena secure a $100 billion deal that had eluded every major corporation? What did she do at Marcus and his mistress's wedding that would shock not just the groom, but every guest, every business partner, and the entire world watching? And why was their once sick child smiling like he knew exactly what justice was about to be served? The morning Marcus Sterling decided to divorce his wife, he'd received the preliminary rejection from Chen Technologies, the 5th rejection for the $100 billion infrastructure contract that represented the holy grail of the tech world. Elena had been in the kitchen, dark circles under her eyes from another sleepless night at their son Tyler's bedside, and Marcus remembered feeling nothing but contempt as he watched her mechanically prepare breakfast with trembling hands. She'd been his college sweetheart once, back when he was nobody. Back when his startup was just fever dreams scribbled on napkins in their studio apartment. Elena had worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat, had believed in his vision when investors laughed him out of boardrooms, had held him through every failure, and celebrated every tiny victory as if he'd conquered the world. But that woman, that devoted, selfless woman, had been replaced by this exhausted shell, this constant reminder of everything draining his resources, his time, his future. Tyler's medication costs are going up again, Elena had said quietly, not looking at him, stirring oatmeal that would probably go uneaten because their 7-year-old son could barely keep food down anymore. Doctor, Morrison says the experimental treatment might help, but insurance won't cover it. We'd need to liquidate some assets, maybe take out a loan against what, Elena? Marcus had snapped, his voice sharp enough to make her flinch. Against the company I've built? The company that's this close to landing the Chen deal? He'd held up his fingers, pinching air. You want me to sabotage everything I've worked for because Tyler needs another expensive treatment that probably won't even work? The words had landed like physical blows. Elena's face had drained of color, but she didn't cry. She'd stopped crying months ago. Somewhere between Tyler's 4th hospitalization and Marcus's affair with Vanessa becoming an open secret in their social circle. Instead, she just nodded. That blank acceptance that made Marcus irrationally angry because it highlighted his own cruelty, forced him to see himself clearly, and he hated her for that mirror she held up. I'll figure something out, she'd whispered, and Marcus had felt a savage satisfaction that he'd later recognize as the moment he'd fully transformed into someone he wouldn't have recognized 5 years earlier. Vanessa had been different from the start, all sharp ambition and calculated charm. A corporate attorney who understood power dynamics and never looked at him with disappointed expectations. She didn't bring problems, she brought solutions, connections, opportunities. When Elena found out about the affair, she hadn't screamed or thrown things like Vanessa had predicted with almost gleeful anticipation. She just asked one question with those tired, broken eyes. Does she make you happy, Marcus? And when he'd said yes, cruelly, definitively, yes, Elena had simply nodded and said, then I won't fight you. I just ask that you help with Tyler's medical expenses. That's all I want from you. The divorce had been swift and cold. Marcus's lawyers had been ruthless, and Elena, focused entirely on Tyler's deteriorating health, had signed away almost everything, just to avoid a prolonged battle that would drain time and resources she desperately needed for their son. Marcus had felt victorious walking out of that courthouse, Vanessa's arm linked through his, already planning their future together. He'd told himself Elena would be fine, that she was resilient, that she'd always landed on her feet before. He'd conveniently forgotten that she'd only ever landed on her feet because she was catching him every time he fell. Tyler's last words to him, spoken from a hospital bed with IV lines running from his small arms, had been, "Daddy, why don't you love me anymore?" Marcus had deflected, made excuses about business trips and important meetings, and had left before his son's tears could make him feel the guilt he was desperately suppressing. He'd convinced himself that children were resilient, that Tyler would forget, that clean breaks were better than prolonged suffering. Vanessa had reinforced these narratives with perfectly logical arguments about self-care and not setting yourself on fire to keep others warm. And Marcus had drunk deep from that well of justification. 3 months later, Marcus stood in his penthouse overlooking the city, champagne in hand, explaining to Vanessa's father, a federal judge with connections that spanned the political spectrum, exactly why he was the perfect candidate to marry his daughter. "Elena was my past," Marcus said smoothly, the lie rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. "She couldn't keep up with my ambitions. Couldn't understand the sacrifices required at this level. Vanessa understands power, understands what it takes to build an empire." Judge Whitmore had studied him with calculating eyes that reminded Marcus uncomfortably of Elena's father, a mechanic who'd fixed Marcus's perpetually broken car for free during their struggling years, and who'd stopped speaking to Marcus entirely after the divorce. "And your son?" the judge had asked, tone carefully neutral. "Tyler is being cared for," Marcus replied, which was technically true. His lawyers had ensured that the minimal child support payments were automatically deducted, and he'd heard through the grapevine that Elena had found some charity program to help with medical costs. "Elena is a capable mother. She'll manage." What Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined in his most paranoid nightmares, was that Elena hadn't just managed. She'd thrived in the kind of phoenix from ashes transformation that would become business school, a legend. The same week Marcus had served her divorce papers, Elena had received a call from Dr. Sarah Chen, daughter of the Chen Technologies CEO and a childhood friend. Elena had helped through a devastating period 20 years ago when they'd been college roommates. Sarah had been following Elena's situation, had heard through mutual connections about the divorce and Tyler's illness, and had made Elena an offer. "Come work for me. Not as an employee, as a partner. My father is dying, and he's letting me restructure the company before I take over. I need someone I trust, someone with nothing to lose and everything to fight for. Someone like you." Elena had walked into Chen Technologies with nothing but her old engineering degree, the one she'd earned before sacrificing her career to support Marcus's dreams and a mother's desperate determination to save her child. Within weeks, she'd revolutionized their approach to the $100 billion government infrastructure contract, identifying fatal flaws in every competitor's proposal through insights gained from years of listening to Marcus complain about his own failed attempts. She'd known exactly what didn't work because she'd watched her ex-husband stumble through every possible wrong approach, and she'd quietly absorbed every lesson, every mistake, every missed opportunity. The contract was for a nationwide AI-integrated power grid system, a project so massive and complex that it had broken every company that attempted it. But Elena had seen the solution in the problem itself. Instead of trying to build everything from scratch, she'd proposed partnering with existing regional providers, creating a collaborative network rather than a monolithic system. It was elegant, cost-effective, and politically palatable to both parties in Congress. When Chen Technologies submitted their revised proposal with Elena listed as Chief Innovation Officer, the Government Contract Committee had been skeptical until they'd read the documentation and realized they were looking at the kind of genius-level strategic thinking that appeared maybe once in a generation. Marcus knew none of this as he prepared for his wedding to Vanessa. He'd been too busy celebrating what he thought was his own success. His company had finally landed a modest $50 million contract, barely a footnote compared to the billions his competitors were chasing, but enough to feel like validation. He'd sent Elena the minimum required child support payment and hadn't bothered to check on Tyler in 6 weeks, ignoring his son's calls because hearing that small, sad voice asking when Daddy was coming to visit, made Marcus feel things he didn't want to feel. The wedding was a spectacle designed to showcase Vanessa's social status and Marcus's rising prominence. A historic cathedral with imported flowers, a guest list studded with politicians and business leaders, a reception venue that cost more than Marcus had earned in his first 5 years of marriage to Elena. As Marcus stood at the altar, watching Vanessa approach in a gown that cost more than Tyler's annual medical expenses, he felt a soaring sense of triumph. This was his new life, polished, powerful, unencumbered by the messy complications of sick children and martyred ex-wives. This was what success looked like, and he'd earned it by making hard choices that weaker men couldn't make. Then the cathedral doors crashed open with a sound like divine judgment, and Marcus's carefully constructed world began its spectacular collapse. Elena walked through those doors in a simple black dress that probably cost less than the flower arrangements, but she wore it with the kind of quiet power that made every head turn and every conversation stop. Beside her walked Tyler, not the pale, fragile child Marcus remembered, but a healthy, glowing boy with bright eyes and confident posture, holding his mother's hand like they were walking into battle together. Behind them came Sarah, Chen, easily recognizable as one of the most powerful women in tech, and a full camera crew from 3 major news networks. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Elena said, her voice carrying through the cathedral's acoustics with crystal clarity, "but I thought my ex-husband should know that while he was planning this wedding, I was closing the $100 billion Chen Technologies contract, the same contract his company failed to secure 5 times. She paused, letting the words sink in, watching Marcus's face drain of color. "I also thought he should know that the experimental treatment he refused to help fund for our son, I was able to afford it with my signing bonus. Tyler's been in remission for 6 weeks. Marcus hasn't bothered to call and find out." The cathedral erupted in whispered chaos. Vanessa stood frozen at the altar, her perfect smile cracking like cheap porcelain. Judge Whitmore's expression transformed from polite ceremony to barely concealed fury as he realized his daughter was marrying a man who'd abandoned a sick child. Marcus couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't process the impossible reality unfolding before him. This couldn't be happening. Elena was supposed to be struggling, barely surviving, living in the shadow of his success. She wasn't supposed to be powerful, wasn't supposed to win, wasn't supposed to matter anymore. "I didn't come here for revenge," Elena continued, speaking directly to Marcus now with eyes that held no hatred, only a devastating clarity. "I came here because Tyler asked me to. He wanted to see his father one last time, wanted to show you he got better, wanted you to know he survived without you." She placed her hand on their son's shoulder. "But now he understands what I've always known. You're not worth his tears or his time. We're going to be fine, Marcus. Better than fine. We're going to be extraordinary." She turned to address the frozen wedding guests. "I apologize for the disruption. Please continue with your celebration. I just wanted to ensure everyone knew exactly what kind of man is getting married today. The kind who abandons his sick child for a newer model. The kind who throws away a devoted wife the moment she becomes inconvenient. The kind who mistakes cruelty for strength." Her smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "Congratulations on your wedding, Marcus. I hope she treats you better than you treated us. Though honestly, you deserve worse." The news crews were already broadcasting, their cameras capturing every moment of Marcus's public humiliation. His phone was exploding with notifications, messages from business partners suddenly reconsidering their associations, from investors concerned about his character, from former colleagues who'd always quietly supported Elena and were now vocal about their disgust. The $50 million contract he'd been celebrating? The company had a morality clause, and footage of him abandoning his sick child was already going viral. Vanessa was backing away from the altar, horror and calculation warring in her expression as she realized this marriage was now a liability rather than an asset. Judge Whitmore looked ready to call off the ceremony himself, his political instincts recognizing a public relations disaster when he saw one unfolding in real time. But the final blow came from Tyler himself. The 7-year-old walked forward, stopping a few feet from his father and spoke with the kind of devastating wisdom that only suffering and survival can teach. "I used to cry every night asking Mommy why you didn't love me," Tyler said, his voice small but steady. "I thought I did something wrong. Thought if I got better you'd come back. But Mommy told me the truth. Some people only love you when it's easy, when it makes them look good, when it doesn't cost them anything. You're one of those people, Dad, and I don't need people like that in my life anymore." He took his mother's hand. "I got better not because of you, but despite you. We both did." Marcus watched them walk away, his ex-wife, who'd become a billionaire while he wasn't looking, his son, who'd survived and thrived without his presence, and felt the full weight of every choice he'd made crushing down on him. This wasn't just public humiliation. This was a complete character assassination backed by irrefutable facts and broadcast to millions. His reputation was destroyed, his contracts were evaporating, his marriage was collapsing before it began, and all he could do was stand there and realize, with horrifying clarity, that Elena hadn't just won the $100 billion contract, she'd won everything that mattered, including the moral high ground he'd surrendered when he'd chosen ambition over love, convenience over commitment, cruelty over compassion. The cathedral doors closed behind Elena and Tyler with a finality that sounded like a prison cell slamming shut on Marcus's future. And in the ringing silence that followed, Marcus Sterling understood that some divorces don't end when the papers are signed. They end when the person you underestimated shows you exactly how much you lost and how little you deserved them in the first place. 2 years after the wedding that never was, Marcus Sterling sat in a cramped studio apartment in a building that would have horrified his former self. Scrolling through news articles on a laptop that had seen better days, the headline that dominated his screen read, "Chen Technologies CEO Elena Sterling announces $250 billion expansion into sustainable energy. 9-year-old son Tyler Sterling named inspiration behind Youth STEM initiative." The photograph showed Elena at a press conference, confident and radiant in a way Marcus had never seen during their marriage, because he'd never given her reason to shine. Beside her stood Tyler, now a healthy, bright-eyed fourth grader who'd become something of a media darling, the sick child who'd survived, thrived, and whose mother had transformed her pain into purpose. The article mentioned Elena's foundation that provided free medical treatment for children whose families couldn't afford experimental therapies. The same treatments Marcus had once deemed too expensive, too inconvenient, too much of a drain on his ambitions. Marcus had kept his last name, though it now felt like wearing someone else's identity. Elena had reclaimed her maiden name Sterling and had made it synonymous with innovation, integrity, and the kind of success that didn't require stepping on others to achieve. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that his ex-wife had become more successful using the name he'd given her than he'd ever been using it himself. The fallout from that catastrophic wedding day had been swift and merciless. Vanessa had called off the marriage before they'd even left the cathedral, her survival instincts overriding whatever shallow affection she'd felt for Marcus. She'd married a senator's son 8 months later, and Marcus occasionally saw her at social events he could no longer afford to attend, where she looked through him as if he were invisible. Judge Whitmore had used his considerable influence to ensure that Marcus's reputation preceded him in every business circle, not out of vindictiveness, but out of a father's fury at nearly allowing his daughter to tie herself to a man who'd abandoned his sick child. The $50 million contract had evaporated within 72 hours of the viral video, citing the morality clause Marcus had skimmed over when signing. Other contracts had followed, like Domino's investors pulling out, partners distancing themselves, opportunities vanishing overnight. Marcus had tried to rebuild, had pitched to anyone who would listen, but the business world had long memories and no patience for men who abandoned their children. The few meetings he'd secured had ended with polite rejections that barely masked the disgust beneath professional courtesy. His company had folded within 6 months. The penthouse had been sold to cover debts. The luxury cars, the designer suits, the trappings of success he'd valued more than his family, all gone, liquidated, reduced to line items on bankruptcy documents. Marcus now worked as a mid-level consultant for a tech firm that didn't know his history, using a professional alias, earning in a year what he used to spend on a weekend getaway. The humiliation of his fall was compounded by its completeness. He hadn't just lost everything. He'd lost it publicly, spectacularly, with millions of people watching and judging and finding him utterly lacking. But the worst part, the part that kept Marcus awake at night in his studio apartment, with its thin walls and flickering lights, wasn't the financial ruin or the social exile. It was seeing Tyler's face in every news story about Elena's success, seeing his son healthy and happy and thriving without him, seeing the boy he'd called a burden being celebrated as an inspiration, seeing the child he'd abandoned looking at his mother with pure adoration, and never, not once in 2 years, asking about his father in any public interview. Marcus had tried to reach out exactly once, 6 months after the wedding disaster. He'd shown up at Elena's new headquarters, a gleaming building that made his old office look like a storage closet, and had been politely but firmly turned away by security. Elena had sent a message through her assistant. "Tyler is happy and healthy. He doesn't need the chaos of your presence disrupting his stability. If you truly love him, you'll respect that. The child support payments are still required by law, but beyond that, you've made your choices clear. Live with them." The child support payments now represented a significant portion of Marcus's modest income, a monthly reminder of the family he'd thrown away for ambitions that had crumbled to dust. He paid them religiously, though he suspected Elena probably donated them. To charity, she certainly didn't need his money anymore. Sometimes Marcus imagined those payments going into the foundation Tyler had inspired, helping other sick children whose fathers weren't cruel enough to abandon them, and the poetic justice of it made him physically ill. He'd seen Tyler once from a distance, about a year after the wedding catastrophe. Marcus had been walking through a park on his lunch break. He took walks now, because he couldn't afford the gym membership he used to maintain, and had spotted Elena and Tyler having a picnic with Sarah Chen and her family. Tyler had been laughing, running around with Sarah's kids, completely carefree in a way Marcus had never seen during their marriage. Elena had looked up at one point, had made direct eye contact with Marcus watching from behind a tree like some kind of stalker, and her expression had held no anger, no hatred, just profound indifference, which was somehow worse. She'd turned back to Tyler without acknowledging Marcus's presence, and he'd walked away feeling like a ghost haunting the life he'd voluntarily surrendered. Marcus clicked through more articles, torturing himself with evidence of Elena's ascension. She'd been featured in Fortune, Forbes, Time magazine, always with Tyler beside her, always telling the story of how a mother's love and determination had driven her to achieve the impossible. Interviewers invariably asked about her ex-husband, and Elena's responses were always measured, never vindictive. "I don't dwell on the past. Tyler and I are focused on building a future where no parent has to choose between medical care for their child and financial stability. That's what matters." But Marcus dwelled on the past constantly, obsessively, because it was the only thing he had left. He'd replay moments from their marriage, seeing now what he'd missed then, how Elena had looked at him with genuine love, even when he'd given her nothing but contempt. How she sacrificed her own dreams to support his. How she'd never asked for anything except his presence and support when their son was dying. He'd searched for the exact moment he'd transformed from the struggling entrepreneur she'd believed in into the monster who'd valued a $100 billion contract. He'd never win over the family who'd always been his greatest achievement. The most devastating article Marcus had found was an interview Elena had given to a women's business magazine, where she'd been asked what advice she'd give to women in difficult marriages. Her response had been measured but clear. "Know your worth. I spent years believing my value came from supporting someone else's dreams while abandoning my own. It took losing everything, my marriage, nearly losing my son, being left with nothing to realize I was never the weak one in that relationship. The person who stays, who fights, who sacrifices, that's strength. The person who runs when things get difficult, who trades love for convenience, that's weakness disguised as ambition. I wish I'd known that sooner, but I'm grateful I know it now." Marcus had read that paragraph 100 times, each reading driving the knife deeper into his chest. She was right, of course. She'd always been right, and he'd been too blind, too arrogant, too focused on shallow definitions of success to see it. He'd tried dating once, about a year after the wedding disaster. A woman from his new company who didn't know his history had asked him to coffee, and Marcus had thought maybe, possibly, he could start over. But halfway through their conversation, she'd mentioned her nephew who was battling leukemia, and Marcus had felt his throat close up with guilt and shame so profound he'd had to excuse himself. He'd never called her again. How could he build a new relationship when he couldn't escape the specter of the family he'd destroyed? How could he pretend to be a good man when he knew, with absolute certainty, that he was? Fundamentally, not. The studio apartment was silent except for the muffled sounds of his neighbors' lives, bleeding through thin walls, a baby crying, a couple laughing, normal people living normal lives, unburdened by the weight of unforgivable choices. Marcus closed his laptop and looked around at his reduced circumstances, understanding, with crystal clarity, that this wasn't just punishment. This was who he actually was, when stripped of money and status and the ability to hide behind success. He was small, he was cruel. He was the kind of man who'd look at his dying child and see an inconvenience rather than the greatest blessing of his life. Meanwhile, across the city, in a home filled with light and laughter and love, Elena tucked Tyler into bed and kissed his forehead, listening as her son talked excitedly about the science project he was working on, about the friend's birthday party coming up, about all the normal, beautiful concerns of a healthy 9-year-old who'd been given a second chance at life. She didn't think about Marcus anymore. Not really, he was just a chapter in her story, not the story itself, and she'd written far better chapters since then. "Mom?" Tyler asked as Elena turned off the light. "Do you think Dad ever thinks about us?" Elena paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the hallway light, and chose her words carefully. "Probably," she said honestly. "But sweetie, what matters isn't whether he thinks about us. What matters is that we're happy, healthy, and surrounded by people who genuinely love us. Some people are meant to be in our lives forever, and some people are just meant to teach us lessons about what we deserve." "What did he teach you?" Tyler asked. Elena smiled, and it was genuine, free of bitterness. "He taught me that I'm stronger than I ever knew, that I can build an empire from nothing, that I can save your life and change the world and raise an incredible son all by myself. Those are pretty valuable lessons, even if he didn't mean to teach them." "I'm glad you're my mom," Tyler said sleepily. "You're the best one in the whole world." "And you're the best, son," Elena replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Now sleep. We have that foundation event tomorrow, and those kids are excited to meet you." She closed the door softly and walked downstairs to her home office, where the plans for Chen Technologies' next phase of expansion waited for her review. But before diving into work, Elena opened her desk drawer and pulled out an old photograph, her Marcus and infant Tyler, taken in their studio apartment 12 years ago, when they'd had nothing but each other and dreams. She studied Marcus's face in that photo, trying to see the seeds of who he'd become, trying to understand when love had transformed into cruelty. But she didn't linger long. That version of Marcus, the one who'd held his newborn son with tears of joy streaming down his face, who'd promised Elena they'd build a life together. No matter what obstacles they faced, that man was a ghost, if he'd ever truly existed at all. The real Marcus had revealed himself when tested, and that revelation had been the greatest gift he'd ever given her, even if he'd never understand that. Elena put the photograph back in the drawer, closed it firmly, and turned to her computer screen, where the future waited bright and limitless and entirely hers to shape. She'd won more than a $100 billion contract that day at the cathedral. She'd won her freedom, her son's health, her own identity, and the unshakable knowledge that she'd never again settle for less than she deserved. And Marcus? Marcus was still sitting in his studio apartment, scrolling through articles about his ex-wife's success, trapped in a past he couldn't change and a future he'd destroyed with his own hands. He'd lost a $100 billion contract, but more devastatingly, he'd lost a $1 billion woman and a priceless son, and no amount of regret could ever buy back what he'd thrown away. Some lessons are expensive, some lessons cost everything, and some men never learn them until it's far, far too late.